But joining me now, Suzanne Craig, investigative reporter for the New York Times, and Charles Coleman, former Brooklyn, New York prosecutor and MSNBC legal analyst. Sue, here in studio, we'll start with you. You've been in this courtroom since the beginning of this trial. Give me a sense of how you interpreted Hope Hicks' testimony. How do you describe it?
First, I want to say we should just talk about the mountain lion. But
I need a copy of that Palm Beach Post. Yes.
Hope Hicks was an interesting witness. And part of the reason for that is for the last 2 weeks, we've been hearing a lot from, I would say, the scoundrels of all of this. We heard a lot from David Pecker, the head of the National Enquirer, and his relationship with Donald Trump. And then we heard from Keith Davidson, this LA lawyer who brokered the deal both between the hush money payments, the payments between both Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. And the details were very sordid, and their backgrounds are pretty sordid, and you kind of felt like every day you were being pulled through the gutter when you were sitting in court.
Yeah.
Hope Hicks came in, and it was a different witness. And it's not to say that the other ones don't have, especially I would focus on David Pecker, still seems to have some affinity for Donald Trump. But Hope Hicks really was, I would say, a friendlier witness. She's paying for her own legal fees, but has a lot of affinity for Donald Trump. And I think in that sense was a powerful witness for what she had to say. And there was some pretty, I would say, hurtful information that came out to Donald Trump in her testimony.
Yeah, I'm going to dig into that a little bit with you. So Hope Hicks, she was there, Charles, under subpoena, made it very clear she didn't want to be there, said right off the top that she was nervous. Did her testimony at all reveal to you a reluctant witness? I mean, what role do you think her testimony had showing Donald Trump's alleged motive in this case?
Well, I think everything that you're talking about, Alex, only makes her a better witness for the prosecution, in as much as she did not appear to be a witness who particularly wanted to be there necessarily, but was going to be there and tell the truth while she was. I think her nervousness that she's described as having had in the beginning is something that the jury likely picked up on. But at the same time, none of it, I have any reason to believe, affected her truthfulness. And so ultimately, if you're a prosecutor in this case, you're going to argue that, look, this may not have been someone who was the happiest to have been here, but they came before you and they told the truth. They did not have an axe to grind. They didn't have a motive to advance, but they stood here and they gave you what it is that they knew based off of what it is that they had seen and experienced. And that's the type of witness that you want as a prosecutor, which is why Hope Hicks' testimony may be more damaging to Donald Trump than many people think.
So there was this key exchange when Hope Hicks testified that Trump told her Michael Cohen told him he paid Stormy Daniels out of the kindness of his heart. I'm going to go through the testimony. The prosecutor asked, and did the idea that Mr. Cohen would have made a $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels out of the kindness of his heart, was that consistent with your interactions with him up to that point? After an objection, she said, I would say that would be out of character for Michael. The prosecutor asked, why would it be out of character from Michael? Hicks, again, after another objection, I'd say that would be out of character from Michael. I did not know Michael to be an especially charitable or selfless person. He is a kind of person who seeks credit. Why was this an important exchange, Sue?
Well, it places Donald Trump in a conversation with a trusted aide. I think, first of all, talking about the hush money payment, that he was aware of it and that Michael Cohen paid it. So I think there's two pieces to that. He said all along that it's legal fees. And as we get to the back end of this case, we're going to be talking about sort of the falsification of documents. But his claim all along has been it was for legal fees, that it wasn't a payment for Stormy Daniels. So I think that was pretty critical. And another piece of the conversation that happened in that interaction between Hope Hicks and Donald Trump in 2018 was he said, well, better it comes out now than during the election. And that could be, you know, you don't know, you could, I just think in the end that it's not going to look good that he at least had a recognition.
Well, it's not like he's worried about the family,
no,
because any time would hurt the family.
And that he had a recognition that it was really good. It didn't come out during the election when the payment was made.
Yeah, good point there. So on cross-examination, defense attorneys asked Hicks if Cohen ever went rogue, and she said yes. She said she used to say that he liked to call himself a fixer or Mr. Fix-It, and it was only because he first broke it. Charles, do you think this is going to be how the defense frames this case to the jury, that Michael Cohen just went rogue in paying off Stormy Daniels?
Absolutely, Alex. What you've seen the defense do when they've had the opportunity is try and separate Michael Cohen or other witnesses from Donald Trump as much as possible. So, for example, in their questioning of different witnesses on cross-examination, they may ask, but you never met Donald Trump and you never spoke to Donald Trump and Donald Trump never told you to do this. And you can anticipate that that's going to be a large part of their strategy. In addition to where they can't do that, they're going to try and muddy up the waters so that everyone seems very dirty as possible. And the jury may say, ultimately, I don't know what to believe, but I can't believe anything beyond a reasonable doubt because it seems like everybody here was all crooked. So, yes, that is definitely a strategy to try and make Michael Cohen seem as though he is this sort of putz of a guy who can't get everything right, but wants to do so for the purposes of impressing a boss who never entrusted him to do these things in the first place. That would be the best way to get Donald Trump closer to an acquittal or at least to a hung jury, which, of course, is their goal.
What happens, Charles, if the jury doesn't find Michael Cohen credible when he takes the stand?
That's a great question. And in another case, I would say the prosecution would need to be extremely worried. But what it does, quite frankly, Alex, is it highlights the importance of the testimony of other witnesses like David Pecker and Hope Hicks, because you can say to your jury on summation, look, even if you don't like Michael Cohen, even if you think that everything that Michael Cohen stood up here and told you was a lie, you still have the testimony of these other witnesses who've laid out this entire scheme in front of you, who've given you these dots, and then you have the documents, the evidence of the actual documents themselves that Sue just talked about that you're going to see entered into evidence over the course of the next week that are going to substantiate everything that's already been told to you. So even if you disregard Michael Cohen as being someone who has no credibility, there is still mountains of evidence that support what we have said to you Donald Trump is guilty of, and that's why you should fine for us.
I'm curious, Sue, how Donald Trump handled himself in court yesterday, listening to this formerly very close aide, someone who's been described as almost like a daughter to him. Right. Did she manage to humanize him for the jury, particularly when she said the part like, I didn't want the newspapers to be delivered to the home, to the residents, for fear that Melania would see them and get upset?
I thought that comment was interesting because it sort of is like you imagined Melania in this tower where she has no other incoming information, so we're not going to drop the newspapers off. I sort of went, oh, okay, it didn't really add up to me, that one comment. But I don't know how, when I think about Donald Trump's behavior in court, for the most part, he's sitting there and he has his eyes closed. You know, you've heard occasionally he may nod off, but for the most part, he's got his eyes closed. He's trying not to have any reaction to what's going on in the courtroom. You know, occasionally he will pay attention and he'll be watching a witness, but for the most part, we're not seeing that. I'm interested in how that is playing with the jury because they're watching him and they're seeing that. I can't imagine that's helping him. We don't know, but that's sort of why I'm interested in sort of what he's doing. But you didn't see any sort of outbursts or facial expressions, anything out of the ordinary while Hope Hicks was testifying, even when she started crying on the stand. I didn't notice it if it happened. Yeah.
Trump did make some confusing comments when it comes to his ability to testify. He did so outside the courtroom later on this week. Let's take a listen to that.
I'm not allowed to testify because this judge, who's totally conflicted, has me under an unconstitutional gag order. Nobody's ever had that before, and we don't like it, and it's not fair.
The gag order stop you from testifying?
No, it won't stop me from testifying. The gag order is not for testifying. The gag order stops me from talking about people and responding when they say things about me. We have people saying things about me, and I'm not allowed to respond.
Apparently the wrong interpretation there, because Judge Merchan began trial yesterday clarifying the gag order does not prevent Donald Trump from testifying. What went on there, Sue?
Donald Trump just made that up, you know, to rile up his base. And the judge came into court and said very calmly that there seems to be a misunderstanding and that that's not the case. Donald Trump can take the stand if he wants, talk to his counsel, but he is welcome to do that. Just completely just put it to bed and then said, ordered the jury, you know, let's get the jury in here. Donald Trump did this once before in this trial. He went out and announced, he now at the beginning, he asked for, I think it was whatever it was, 1 or 2 days off, but one of the days that he wanted off, he asked for 2 days off. One of the days that he wanted off was so he could attend his son's graduation.
Yeah.
And there was no immediate ruling on that when he asked for it. And he turned around and went outside or put out a fundraising note, whatever he did, or both, and said that he's not allowed to even attend Barron's graduation. He's just making stuff up. Certainly not the first time we've seen him do that. It won't be the last time. But that's the games that are being played.
Yeah.
He's trying to just rile up his base.
Totally interesting that Judge Merchan came back and said, it's a bit of a misunderstanding. He could have used the word calculus.
He was so cool about it.
Yeah.
And that's what I really liked about how he handled it. When he started talking, you almost didn't know where he was going. He was just, it's a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
I just want to set the record straight on this. He did, very calmly, and then said, let's bring the jury in.
Interesting. Charles, I'm curious, why would Judge Merchan be so adamant to clarify to Trump's attorneys, though, that the former president is allowed to testify? Is he signaling to them, get him to stop saying this?
I really thought we were going to talk about the mountain lion, but since we're still on Donald Trump, it was really Judge Merchan, I think, being abundantly clear about the record and how things were being used. Not necessarily that Judge Merchan is paying a ton of attention to what Donald Trump is saying in the press and responding that way. But I do think that making the record clear about Donald Trump's rights and abilities is something that, of course, that his attorney should know. But in the interest of preserving any notion of an appeal or any sort of sense of wrongdoing on his part, Judge Merchan really did go far above and beyond what he needed to do in this instance and set the record straight on the record in court where it actually matters. And I think that that's really what it was. In terms of sending a message to his attorneys, I think at this point, Judge Merchan has little expectation around what his attorneys can actually do to control their client, although that's not going to stop him from holding them accountable when he doesn't.
Okay. You want a last word on that?
Yeah, I think the other thing that's going on is Donald Trump has been saying he's going to take the stand. He probably won't. So part of all this is just messaging out that, they're not even letting me take the stand. I mean, that could be the other thing that's going on.
He's calling him out, basically,
right,
but genteelly. There we go.
Right.
Okay. Hey, guys, I'm sorry about the mountain lion. We'll get to that. I will say I do know one thing about mountain lions in California. They are building a crossing over big freeways to allow mountain lions to go from one place to the next so they don't get hit by cars as they're crossing freeways. That's a good story. So we can do that and have you guys back to talk about it.
That's
anyway,
sweet.
Thank you so much.